The little known and often surprising history of the beep on this episode of Toy Train Tips and Tricks. And hello again, this is Mike with another edition of Toy Train Tips and Tricks. And so while unboxing my Christmas items, getting ready for the annual Yuletide layout, pulling out my RMT Beep diesel, the thought occurred to me, what exactly is the beep supposed to be? Obviously, it's a fantasy locomotive. There really was no such thing that looked exactly like this. And it certainly has some GP-7 type features, and even the box calls it an EMD Jeep type switcher. But there are some other features on the model that are clearly not EMD type in nature. So what were the designers of this model thinking when they first put it together? And what has led to the longevity of this little model going through 3 different manufacturers over the course of 6 decades? So let's take a closer look at the Beep.
My first encounter with the Beep-type locomotive was Christmas 1982, when I was the lucky recipient of a Williams Army train set powered by what Williams dubbed the Mighty Might locomotive. The diesel was a short, stubby, 4-wheeled contraption that looked somewhat like a shrunken GP9 to me, and so I dubbed it a Jeep 4.5. I also thought at the time that Williams had originated the design. In fact, the design goes back to the 1950s to a Tennessee toy maker called Kusan, which was, like most toy companies at the time, trying to earn a share of the lucrative toy train market. Kusan's line included a handsome Alco FA diesel, which later became K-Line's FA models, and also a pretty good-looking EMD F7 model that it inherited when it purchased the Auburn Models line of OEH trains in 1954. Kusan's line of AMT F7s and near-scale passenger and freight cars were popular with the modeling portion of the O-gauge market. The FAs and K-Series freight cars found a niche in the lower middle portion of the toy train market, but Kusan was looking for a model that it could package into the bottom line sets for mass merchandisers and special clients, and this new design was the birth of the Beep. The Kusan Beep, or General Purpose Diesel Switcher as Kusan called it, was DC-powered and came with the firm's cheapest 2-rail sets. Yes, this was originally a 2-rail O-gauge model. And it sometimes even came as a battery-powered model. The only add-on detail for the Kusan Beeps were the handrails, which were often omitted to save costs. The battery-powered versions even lacked the truck side frames. It did, however, have a respectable complement of cast-in details. Beginning with the side profile, it's obvious that Kusan's designers were using the then-new EMD GP-7 as the main inspiration for their compact diesel. The truck resembles what an EMD Blomberg-style truck would look like if stretched out to 20 feet or so in length. The location of doors, louvers, and various hatches approximate those of the GP-7 design, though greatly compressed, of course. The cab, however, is both too tall and too wide, looking more like that of an EMD SW series switcher in its relation to the roofline. Looking at the model from the end of the short hood, the EMD-inspired styling continues with the rectangular body, headlight, marker lights, and ladder placement. On the roof, however, things start to get confusing. There is a detailed representation of a steam generator for passenger service, superior to the one Lionel made for its own GP-7 model, by the way. The exhaust for the steam generator is not in the typical EMD location, however, but rather next to the cab in the style of a steam generator-equipped Alco RS3. This similarity continues with the high, rounded cab roof that projects much higher over the car body than a GP-7 cab. And the inclusion of 2 high windows on either side of the steam generator stack suggest an Alco diesel as well. The Alco influence is even more noticeable on the long hood end. Once again, from the walkway to the top of the main car body, the Beep looks just like an EMD Jeep-7. But at the top of the long hood is the biggest clue of all of the Beep's Alco influence, a single, large, Alco-style radiator fan. When I acquired my first beep-style locomotive, that Williams Mighty Might, I assumed that the Alco fan was simply a carryover from Kusan's FA diesel design. However, after acquiring an original Kusan FA, I found that the beep fan was smaller but also much more detailed than the FA version. So the inclusion of this type of fan was not simply a carryover of existing tooling, but a deliberate decision on Kusan's part. Furthermore, the two rectangular vents found on the roof of the Veep do not resemble any rooftop details on the Jeep 7, but the RS3 does indeed have vents of this type and location, although not as pronounced as those on the Beat model. The twin exhaust stacks are somewhat of an enigma. GP7s do in fact have twin exhaust stacks, but EMD used round stacks, and they are always located parallel to the length of the locomotive in the center of the roofline. Alco RS3s used exhaust stacks similar to those on the model, but only a single stack, and it was offside to one side rather than twins. Also, the Alco exhaust is located closer to the radiator fan than it is to the cab. Perhaps the designer used a bit of artistic license to give the roof some symmetry in this case. It is puzzling, however, considering that all of the other locomotive details can indeed be found on a GP7 or an RS3. So, when one carefully examines the details on this locomotive, a Beep is not simply a miniature GP7, but rather a hybrid of a GP7 and an Alco RS3. And since the RS3 and GP7 were both new diesels on the rails at the time Kusan was designing the Beep, the hybrid nature of the locomotive could have been a deliberate attempt to provide buyers with a locomotive that looked somewhat like whatever they were seeing on their local railroad. However, most casual observers never see the roof details of a real locomotive, so this seems unlikely. Another possibility is that the model makers had photographs or diagrams of the Jeep 7 from all sides except the roof. Then, needing detailed information, they could have perhaps sent someone to the nearest railroad overpass to photograph the roof of a diesel to provide details, and that diesel happened to be an RS3. By the early 1960s, a combination of some poor marketing decisions on Kusan's part and the general decline of the toy train market led Kusan to abandon the toy train market, and they sold off their tooling for the train line. Eventually, this tooling found itself in the hands of Williams Trains in the early 1980s. Like Kusan before them, Williams was looking to expand their line of quality reproduction trains and high-end brass imports with a line of inexpensive starter sets, including a classic Army train and a NASA Space Shuttle train set. I gave this engine a detailed look in a previous video, but the short version is that Williams used the same DC-powered drivetrain as before, but also included a diode rectifier so the user could convert the Beep to single-direction AC-powered operation if so desired. The Williams Beep, or Mighty Might as it was now called, was a three-rail locomotive, but the plastic drivetrain was both noisy and lightweight, so the Williams Beep is not a great puller. After 2 years of lackluster sales, Williams kept the higher-end near-scale rolling stock and F7 toolings for themselves and sold the rest to K-Line, who used many of the inexpensive K-Series rolling stock dies and the Kusan FA models. K-Line did not make use of the Beep tooling and instead sold it, once again, to ready-made toys. The first RMT Beep was a non-powered model that served as a tractor-trailer load. Before long, RMT realized the potential of the Beep to be an entry point into the then booming toy train market, and they totally revamped the model. RMT's Beep had twin motors, was AC powered with electronic reverse unit, featured directional lighting, operating couplers, and metal handrails. Add-on details like walkway chains were also added. Originally sold for under $50, operators couldn't get enough of these little diesels, and they were released in dozens of road names. Eventually, the costs of doing business overseas and other economic factors led RMT to raise the price of the Beep, eventually to more than $100, and sales declined. Other changes were underway at RMT as well, and the firm decided to close its doors in 2016. Luckily, the line was revived shortly thereafter, but the Beep and other locomotives were no longer produced. While Kusan's original Beep diesel never sold as well as Lionel's venerable Santa Fe F3 diesels at the time, the design must be considered a success. The model was produced in various forms over more than 60 years by 3 different manufacturers, and the RMT version, with its added details, directional lighting, and twin motors, is certainly the best looking, best running, and most popular of all the Beep varieties. While the prototype diesels that provided the inspiration for the model were the best selling diesels of the early 1950s, they are now nearly extinct, with only a few examples of each surviving in museums or on tourist lines. The model survived the original. Oh, and if you think the idea of a four-wheeled diesel is pure fantasy, check out these modern examples built by Republic Locomotive and Brookville Locomotive, each of which bears more than a little resemblance to our little Beep. Oh, and there's one more interesting chapter in the Beep story. There actually was a locomotive that was known to rail fans far and wide as the Beep. Santa Fe switcher number 1460 was a Baldwin VO 1000 switcher that was rebuilt with an EMD prime mover, trucks, and a Jeep-type long hood, but kept its Baldwin cab. The locomotive was a one-of-a-kind experiment that served as the shop switcher at Santa Fe's Claiborne, Texas shops from 1970 into the early 2000s. Today, the Santa Fe Beep is on display at the Western American Railroad Museum in Barstow, California.
And so now you know there's more to the story of this little diesel than just it's a shrunken GP-7. And so the next time you see one of these at a show or on an online auction site, give a little respect for this long surviving diesel and its long and interesting history. Keep the trains running, and we'll catch you next time with more Toy Train Tips and Tricks.